So like we were saying before, I'm just going to go through a couple of tips and tricks here that I kind of use on articles for formatting code and making the code look all right. This is probably going to be a pretty quick one, but there's some stuff in here that's definitely important. You almost like not realize how important some of these little things are that we do in these articles. So, like I said, why is it so important? I had heard this study a while back, and I think it came back up again pretty recently, maybe in like 2015 or 2016, that most people look at a website and within 15 seconds, they decide whether or not they're going to stay on that website. So for us as writers, if you think of a person on average reading 200, 300 words a minute, it's only about 63 words they get into your article before they decide whether or not they're going to keep reading it. And if you write average size articles, probably 1,000 words, 1,500 words, you only get about 4% in there. So you can kind of guess that most people aren't reading your article before they decide whether or not they're going to keep reading your article. Right? They kind of just scan it, they look at it, say, okay, does this have the information I'm looking for? Does it look like it's usable for me? So one of the most important things that we have to do as authors is make sure that the information looks presentable. Because like I said, they're probably not going to read it before they decide whether or not they're going to continue to, read all the way to the end of your article. So just to give you a pretty quick, nasty example of the difference between well-formatted code and bad code, if you put the left in your article, most people will probably cringe. If you put the right, that's pretty understandable what's going on, and that usually keeps people engaged, and they can see, okay, this is so I put time into formatting this correctly, and I can read this real easy and figure out what's going on. So real quick, I have just four full tips that I use personally. I'm sure there's many more, but these are just the 4 things I try to focus on when I'm adding code into an article. And the first one's removing any boilerplate code, so you focus on what's important. Make sure you focus on formatting and indenting. I know it's kind of usually a pain spot for most people. It's a pain in the butt to do it, but it's really important, and we'll see why in a second, why that's such an essential part. Selecting appropriate names, and they depend on the context, and removing comments. So first, just to get the definitions right, boilerplate code is anything that is repetitive or doesn't actively add something to your example. That includes like getters and setters, that includes adding your main method in, and you can see here why that's, even those little couple extra lines clutter up the point of what you're trying to make. So if you look on the right, I'm just trying to say hello world, right? On the left, that is the correct Java way to do it. The example on the right won't compile, but it's a lot clearer what's going on. And usually readers can understand that for them to execute that code, they'd have to put it inside a main method. I mean, unless you're writing a very, very basic article, like how to write your first Java program, then something on the left's appropriate. But if you're writing something like how to do Spring MVC, you're hoping that the audience has understood that they have to write this inside a main method or execute this somehow. But like I said, the example on the right just shows you how much more focused and clear it is that we're trying to do. And same thing goes for getters and setters. Usually a good trick is to either just leave them out entirely and implicitly say, you're going to add the getters and setters, or what I usually do is just put a comment in there that says that they're there. So you're not going to waste visual space. There's not as many lines there that show, unneeded information. We all know what a getter and a setter are. And I'll come back to it in a second. And I know one of the rules was take out comments, but we'll loop back on that in a few minutes. So indenting and spacing. Every language has got their own conventions for it. Python's usually a 4-space or 2-space language. Java, you see a lot of people either use tabs or 4 spaces. But the idea is basically you follow the rules of the language and you kind of keep it well formatted. And one of the main reasons for that is this example we're seeing again. Both the left and the right are compilable in Java, so both of them will run. But if you're going to read this, it's a much easier read on the right than it is on the left. So again, it doesn't actually functionally change anything, but allows you to understand it a lot better. And all this information I know sounds pretty basic, and it becomes like second nature to do it. But a lot of times, even if I copy and paste something into an article from GitHub repo that I made or a project that I'm working on. Even making sure everything's left aligned and I don't have it, spaced out 2 tabs, everything. It kind of clutters up the code that you write. Then the third thing is selecting appropriate names. And this goes even when you're writing code. For me, when I try to write code, as best I can, I'm not perfect at it, but I usually try to make it read like a book so that you're able to read off the code as if it was telling you what it's doing. And we'll see in a second the difference those naming conventions can make. But just like the indentation and spacing, every language has its own naming conventions. If you go into Python, you're probably using all lowercase and underscores for variable names. If you go into Java, you're probably using camel case with a lowercase starting letter. But the idea is to follow the conventions of that language and just stick to them the entire time. So just another example of good naming and bad naming. If you, hopefully on the right, you can read through and see exactly what it's doing. Even if you don't understand Java, you can kind of get an idea of what's going on the example on the right. And the example on the left does the exact same thing. Functionally, they act exactly the same, but it's much harder to figure out what's going on. And it's probably going to lead to either more explanation in your article, so more text, more things for you to write, more things for you to proofread, and more things for the reader to read. Or if you don't add that in, then it's probably going to end up being a point of confusion for the reader and trying to figure out, okay, if I set those flags to true, false, and false, what do true, false, and false mean? So you're going to end up with either 2 bad situations where the reader doesn't understand what's going on, or if you're trying to add clarity, you're going to, might have to type an extra paragraph or 2 just to explain something that could have been made easier in the code itself. And then there's one important exception when you have naming. Any type of loops, almost every language they do this. The loop indexes or indices are usually I or J or K, depending on how far you go. So there are certain exceptions, but the rule should generally be name everything as explicitly as possible, except in these, handful of situations. And just one more time, this is just me playing with, the left and the right are exactly the same functionally, just the naming is completely different. So it's a lot harder to tell what's going on the example on the left, even though, again, they do the exact same thing. So hopefully we shoot for more of the example on the right when we write articles, because that's a lot easier for the reader to digest it, and there's no explanation needed outside of the code itself. And the last thing is, as best we can, usually you try to remove comments. Even when you write the code itself, comments usually tell you that something's not clear, that you have to add supplemental information. But especially in an article, you have the ability to explain something in more detail in the article itself, or talk around around the code, rather than putting comments directly into the code. Because you can see a lot of times that creates a lot of white space, that creates a bigger code example that's harder to read through. You want the code examples to be as small and as concise as possible. And like I said, that second bullet point kind of talks more about how we code, that you want the code to explain itself. You don't want to have to add that supplemental information. And this is kind of common, what you see on some articles, that you'll see a block of comments in there instead of the article itself describing it. I mean, the reader's going to an article and there's something that you expect the reader not to understand. It's usually better to describe it in text than it would be in the code itself. I mean, that's the point of the article. And as Thomas said, yes, code never lies, and comments something do. Yes, that is very true. So like you're saying, you want your code to speak for itself, and then you kind of write around it if you do need an explanation in the article. And just as a kind of like supplemental resources, these are 3 books I found pretty helpful, specifically for writing articles. The first one's probably a staple in just about any software developer's library. Usually the author's called Uncle Bob, so you could probably look up Uncle Bob Clean Code, and you'll find this book just describes how you write what he considers clean code, which is code, like Thomas said, that just describes itself. You don't have to have any supplemental information. It's just so clear what's going on directly from the code. And second book is Steve Krug's book, Don't Let Me Think. and he's got a revised edition that came out a few years ago. But he just talks about how to do things so that they're so intuitive people just understand them. You don't have to describe something outside of the thing itself. You know, if you put a push sign on a pull door, you're going to cause serious problems for most people getting into that building. So it's just a book that kind of shows you in a software realm how to make things intuitive. And then the last book is a book on just how to make things as concise as possible when you're writing an article or writing code. And this one's actually not specifically for software. This is just for any website or if you're creating web content. But I found it pretty useful about how to format an article and make things look visually appealing when you scan it and doesn't look like it's overwhelming to a reader. Yes, I could throw these links in the chat in a little bit. I'll just look up the links to them. But again, those are just 3 I found useful. I'm sure there's plenty more. And if anybody has any suggestions, I'd love to hear them because we know we only get so much of improving on writing and just improving on how we release our articles. And does anybody have any questions, any specific comments they want to make?
I had a question.
Sure.
So first of all, this was really a cool presentation. So thank you for this. So I was wondering from a kind of readability perspective, which is better, using like inline code or code snippets?
Usually, if it's something really simple, like maybe if it's like a variable assignment, I'll usually put them inline. If you're writing something like a larger block, like my personal thing is there's never like a hard and fast rule, but usually if it goes over 2 lines, or if it's 2 lines or more, I'll put it in a code block and then describe it. But usually as long as it's small enough that it makes sense inline, I keep it there. And again, usually like a rule of thumb is just if it goes over more than 1 line, I'll put it in a code block. Does anybody else have any other questions?
So hi, Justin. I think this is just a suggestion. I think better if we can add complete code into the documentation what we are writing, because let's say or maybe in the documentation or into the GitHub account, because let's say a new person coming into the website and learning, let's say, Java code. So it's really hard to find the Maven dependencies and etc. from just by looking at the code snippet, right? So I would suggest to have the complete code inside the in the document as well. Just a suggestion.
Right. That's very true, especially if you're doing a more introductory article or you're doing a larger article. One thing I usually try to do is instead of adding maybe the code itself directly into the article, you can create like a project and host it up on GitHub, and you can link to that so that if the person wants to run it, they could just pull this entire repo and run it, and then they can look through that Maven POM file and see what dependencies they need to run. But that's kind of just a personal preference, and it depends on the context or the topic that you're writing on. Does anybody else have any more questions?
I don't have any question, but I want to add something based on my experience in software development. I think what you said about the removing comments, usually the developers are lazy enough to not to write any comments, and we always ask the people, please write the document, comment it out. But when you said not to do that, I think they become really happy. So the only thing I would like to add, it's a lot of depends. When you say remove the comments, if the project has started and following the solid principles, like what you said, I think that in that way, it would be possible to have the comments differently and not to make it really dirty everywhere there are a lot of comments. But if the project is super complicated and it's not follow the solid principle, I think I agree with the other guy that it would make sense to have at least some descriptions. and to help the other people, because usually in the IT company people are coming and leaving, and the next person will be a victim of a lot of bad practices in the past. So I think in general this helps a lot for the knowledge sharing. But yeah, if you follow the things in the clean code a book, I think you are free of the making a lot of comments. I agree with you. But thanks for the presentation. It was really nice.
Look, and just to make one comment on that, because I don't want the wrong message getting out here. Writing comments itself aren't bad. In articles, usually, even if your code has them, it's probably easier to just describe it in words in the actual article, so that the code itself is as compact as possible. And then just usually when you write code or write comments, the only way you're going to be able to not have to write the comment is if you write your code, like you said, well enough. Because sometimes your comments and the code don't line up. If somebody changed the code and then didn't update the comment, you run into problems. But the prerequisite for not having the comments is that you write your code correctly.
Okay, I have a suggestion. Means the one person asked right now that for a beginner it's tough to write the dependencies part. So we can give the Git link to them, or means give some project repo to them or share them. Means to the DZone, I could ask that if they would be creating some public repository where we could add the codes of project or something like that, so all the contributor can add there.
Right. That's a good idea of keeping it outside of the article itself.
Yeah, means from the public domain, means our private repository will also remain the same here. So for that thing, I could be asking the DZone to create a public repo.
Right.
Yeah, and to the part of the comment section you have mentioned, I could say that we should write our variable names in such a way that they should depict the meaning what they are going to perform. Like a function should tell the function they are saying, means they are doing. Like write a book. So write a book is itself a function name there. So unnecessary comments could be removed because they reduce readability.
Right, I agree.
Yeah.
All right, Blake, I think that's all I've got, unless there's other comments or questions here.